All right. I'm the only one here, so this will be a little bit strange, but we'll see what we can do. And then when we meet again at our normal time, we can go from there. Okay, so I want to introduce the section on religion and morality. Okay, so this might be kind of quick. Okay, so here's a question. This is a question that Gallup has asked since oh gosh, I feel like sometime in the 1960s. We'll look at a minute. So suppose here's the question, right? If your party nominated a generally well qualified president for person who happened to be blank, would you vote for that person? Right? So people are given a bunch of different sort of options here. Let me well, anyway, here's from around 2014, right? This is a quotation about this survey, right? 96% of Americans would vote for a black president, well, only 4% would not, right? 95% would vote for a woman. Characteristics that don't really dissuade people, at least in the abstract, right? So most Americans, it seems, would vote for a black person or a woman for president, right? Like the vast majority, right? Other groups don't fare as well. Only 68% of people said they'd vote for a gay or lesbian candidate. Bottoming out the list, atheists. A mere 54% of people said they'd vote for an atheist. Right, so Gallup asks this question every year, right? In 2019, the number's up a little bit higher. I think it's like 58%. But I think something about this is surprising, or maybe it's not surprising. Maybe to put it in context, in 2019, when they asked this question, when Gallup asked this question, 93% of Americans said that they would vote for a Catholic, right? Somewhere around 80% said that they'd vote for evangelical Christian. Okay, so why are atheists at the bottom here? Oh, cool. Someone is here. Hi, Julia. Okay.
Hi.
Cool. So yeah, so this is, I was just going over some, I think somewhat surprising, although maybe we'll see it's not surprising, data. But if other people show up, then we can have discussions. If not, you're more than welcome just to discuss with me. So if you have any questions, Julia, just let me know and I'll stop.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. So anyway, this is going to be a discussion or a breakout room sort of thing. If you want to talk through this, we can, Julia. Otherwise, I'm happy to move on. It could be very awkward just having a discussion with one person, but it's up to you.
Okay to move on if that's okay with you.
Okay, yeah, cool. Okay. So maybe so for the benefit of the people watching the recording. Oh, cool, someone else is here. Annie, hi, Annie. Well, anyway.
Hi, sorry.
Yeah, no, don't worry about it. So anyway, perhaps we'll have these discussions in class when we meet at I guess it's a more normal time. I don't know. Maybe it was, I told people about this too at the last minute. Anyway, cool. So something to think about at least. Do you think you'd vote for an avowed atheist? Do you think your parents would, your friends? What do you think they might have misgivings about? Actually, one sort of side note on this question. A new category since 2014 was added to the list, socialist, right? And they're the only ones who score below atheists in the most recent iteration of this poll at 48%. Okay, cool. Okay, anyway, why are people in the United States generally, or not generally, but why are the majority of people in the United States unwilling to vote for an atheist for president, even if they're otherwise well qualified? Well, I don't know. You might give a bunch of different explanations. But one group of people who looked at this polling data suggest the explanation has something to do with the fact that folks just don't trust atheists for some reason. Okay. Okay, so why not? Right? What is it about atheists that make it the case that the majority of Americans don't trust them enough to vote for them for president? Well, so here's a possible explanation, right? Atheists are less likely to act in a trustworthy manner because they don't believe there's a God who's going to punish them if they misbehave. Um, okay, well, here's a question for you to consider on your own. Do we think that theists act any better or worse than atheists in general? I don't know, but something to think about. But anyway, so perhaps the explanation is just that people don't believe that atheists will act trustworthy or in a trustworthy manner because why would they, right? If they're not going to face any eternal divine repercussions for acting untrustworthily. Okay, so at least some folks seem to think that there's this sort of relationship between God on the one hand and morality on the other, right? At least this much. Belief in God keeps people moral, or something like that, right? The picture here being that people act morally because God's watching them. Maybe that's part of the explanation here, right? Why folks won't vote for atheists in the United States, right? It's because they don't trust them, and they don't trust them because they think if they don't believe in God, they won't act in a trustworthy manner. Okay, that's not the only sort of explanation you might give. Here's what I'm going to say is a somewhat common view on morality and God, at least in the United States. Here's a guy named William Lane Craig. He's a theist. He's a philosopher. He's going to argue for this in a paper, right? Quote, today I want to argue that if God exists, then the objectivity of moral values, moral duties, and moral accountability is secured. But that in the absence of God, that is, if God doesn't exist, then morality is just a human convention. And that's to say, morality is wholly subjective and non-binding. Okay, so here's another, I think, somewhat common view in the United States, at least, or Canada, United States, whatever. The view is that God, or the existence of God, is somehow required for morality to have any sort of like objective status, right? If God doesn't exist, then morality is just like your opinion, man, or whatever. Okay. But this is just one person, and a theist at that. Maybe some other people disagree. Well, here's another theist, right? Dostoevsky, right? Maybe you've read some stuff by him. This is from a novel, Brothers Karamazov, I think. Although actually, as I say that, I'm not sure. It doesn't matter. It's from a novel by Dostoevsky. But what will become of men then? I asked him. Without God and immortal life, all things are permitted then. They can do whatever they like. So the sort of rhetorical question here is like, hey, look, if God doesn't exist, then I guess everything's up for grabs, right? You can do whatever you want, right? Because there's no one to sort of set up the moral laws, right? And there's no sort of like reason to even follow any sort of standards of good conduct, right? Because you're not going to be immortal, right? Everything's just going to end. So eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Okay. And finally, we can hear from an atheist. Here's Sartre. The existentialist, this is a philosophical movement, on the contrary, finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist. For there disappears with him all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. There can no longer be any good a priori. That's to say, there can't be anything that's good, and you just like can figure it out by thinking about it, since there's no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it. It's nowhere written that the good exists, that one must be honest or must not lie, since we are now upon the plane where there are only men. Okay, so what Sartre is saying here is something like this. Look, if God doesn't exist, then there are no sort of like moral laws in the universe, right? Anything goes, right? And in fact, the atheist or the existentialist finds this maybe sort of embarrassing. That's Sartre's word. Well, why? Well, because like just anything goes, I guess, right? If God existed, at least there'd be someone to tell us how we ought to act or why we ought to act that way, would give us a reason for acting a particular way rather than another. Right. So look, we've got some theists and some atheists who agree that somehow God is required not only for morality to have sort of any effect on us, right, for us to want or judge it in our interest to act in a moral way, but also for there to be moral laws at all. Laws like thou shalt not steal or thou shalt not murder or whatever, right? Choose your favorite putative moral law. Okay. Okay, so here's the somewhat common view on morality and God. And again, this cuts across both theists and atheists. It's something like this: God's required for objective morality, right? For morality to be more than just like conventions that people have, right? Or just completely human made. Okay. So I don't know, Annie or Julia, do you find this sort of common view plausible, or do you like know anyone who holds this view, or like maybe you hold this view?
Hi. Is the question the God required for morality question?
Yeah, God's required for morality, right?
So I don't think that it's required for morality. I think that for people that don't have a strong sense of right and wrong in themselves, turn to religion for their gauge of what's right and wrong. And I went to Catholic school for all of middle school, and I feel like the things that they were teaching were already like in me already to understand. Like I already knew not to kill people because that was bad and stuff like that. So I don't think that an actual God is required for morality. I think that your own conscience is where your morality comes from.
Okay. Yeah. So as you do the reading for this week, one thing you might find interesting is the stuff on like natural law, right? So the view is that God sort of puts these consciences in us, right? And we can tell just by thinking about it in the sort of natural ends of things that murder is wrong or whatever. So the thing you're saying is maybe actually consistent with the view here, but I think that you and many others would take it as a reason for thinking that God isn't required for morality. Yeah. So good. But yeah, okay. I think this is also a common view, especially around or among younger people as well. I think the demographics are changing. Okay. Okay, so here we have this common view. Why does anyone believe the common view? One explanation you might give is that it's like tradition, or it's traditional to believe these sorts of things. So maybe you learn it in Catholic school, you learn it in church or synagogue or mosque or whatever. Right, so maybe the whole reason that anyone believes this view at all is just that it's traditional, right? It's what they learned growing up or whatever, right? And that's an interesting psychological or sociological hypothesis. We could, I suppose, figure out whether that's the case or not, perhaps by asking people who aren't raised in church or a religious tradition or whatever. Okay, I don't know exactly how to do that, but whatever. That's one thing, perhaps, that explains why people believe the common view, if anyone, in fact, does. And I think it's clear that at least some people, in fact, do believe the common view. I suspect my parents do, for instance. Here's a more sort of like philosophical or deeper reason. So let's go back to Sartre. The existentialist, on the contrary, finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist, for there disappears with him, right, because God doesn't exist, all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven, right? So the sort of idea here, right, is that, look, if God doesn't exist, then it's just atoms in the void or whatever, right? There's cause and effect. There's some little pockets of energy out there in the universe, right? But once you figure out fundamental physics and chemistry and biology and all the rest of the sciences, right, there doesn't seem to be any science of morality, right? It's not as though the biologist or the chemist or the physicist or whatever tells us, ah, yes, well, I have all the biological or chemical or physical facts or whatever, and here are the moral facts in addition, right? There doesn't seem to be any science of morality, right? And if there's no God, then presumably all there is the physical stuff that the scientists investigate. I take it this is a thought that some people have. I don't know if it resonates with anyone here, but I don't know. Sometimes people think this. Here's another reason why someone might believe the common view, and I think I know people who believe the common view for some reason like this. Theists, right, that is to say people who believe in God, tend to usually think God is all-powerful or omnipotent, right? So anything anyone can do, God could do better, right? That sort of idea. So it might seem that the source of goodness or right and wrong must be found in God's will. Right, if God's all powerful, then God gets to decide these sorts of things, right? So here's a quotation from a fundamentalist Christian organization, reference available upon request. Quote, "The Bible teaches that God is the creator of all things," and chapter and verse. All things belong to God, and thus God has the right to make the rules. Right. So on this view, God's so powerful, right, that God can do whatever God wants, right? And among the things that God can do is make the moral rules. Right. Might, as it were, makes right here. Okay. And this is sorry, what's the word I'm looking for? A traditionally or historically important line of thought in Protestant forms of Christianity, especially. So here's John Calvin, for whom Calvinism is named. God's will is so much the highest rule of righteousness that whatever he wills, by the very fact that he wills it, must be considered righteous. Right? So God's so powerful and so great that whatever God says goes. Right? And here's Martin Luther. What God wills is not right because he ought or was bound so to will. On the contrary, what takes place must be right because he so wills. Right? So on this view, it's not as though there are these moral laws out there that God's following. Rather, God is creating the moral laws simply by willing that things be thus and so. Right? So if murder is wrong, right, it's wrong because God wills it to be wrong. Right? And it wasn't as though murders being wrong was something God had to recognize. Rather, God made it the case that murder was wrong, simply by willing that murder should be wrong. Okay, so so 3 reasons so far. Tradition, right, I guess this sort of fits into it. This thought about the world sort of being devoid of meaning without God, right? Because there's just the physical stuff then, presumably, and it's not as though the physical stuff dictates anything about the moral laws. Okay. Okay, so those are some views, right? And maybe you get some sort of psychological explanation for why people believe them, right? Or some sort of more philosophical explanation for why people believe them. But definitely some views that are out there. Right. In this last quotation by Martin Luther, Lutheranism, anyway, that God wills something not because he ought to or was bound so to will, but on the contrary, what takes place must be right because he so wills. Right. A way of making this common view more precise is that if God exists, then God, or goodness rather, can be grounded in God's commands. Right. The view being that God's commands make things moral or immoral. Okay. So what I want to spend some time doing now is unpacking this sort of idea, right? What would it be for God's commands to make things moral or immoral? Okay, well, one way to do it is that we can ask the Euthyphro question. So if you've done the reading part of the reading for the week, the Euthyphro. Here's a question, right? Is an action good or right or pious or whatever because God commands it? Or does God command it because it's good or right? It might be good to sort of pause here and sort of think about what this question is asking. So here are two sorts of pictures, right? And they're both just stories, right? Let's say, but they're maybe instructive. Okay, so what in the Bible or whatever, God creates the heavens and the earth, right? And it takes some time, right? And God does all this stuff, and at the end, the world as we know it exists. Okay, did God have to do anything to make the moral laws? Well, to make the physical laws, for instance, it seems like all God had to do is like make the physical stuff and arrange it in certain ways, right? And as a result of that, that you get like the elements and the way they interact with one another, and et cetera, et cetera. Think back to chemistry class or physics or whatever, right? Simply by making the physical stuff and arranging it in a particular sort of way, the laws sort of come along for free. Okay. Now, when God created the heavens and the earth, right, we can ask this question. Did God have to do something, right, to make the moral laws? Suppose there are moral laws, like thou shalt not kill, right, or that murder is wrong, or whatever, right? Did God have to make those when God created the heavens and the earth, right, or were they there all along? Okay. So that's sort of what the question is asking, or a way of getting at what the question is asking, but we're gonna have to unpack it a little bit more. Okay, so here, I don't follow baseball. Do either of you follow baseball or watch baseball or understand baseball?
I have a general concept of baseball, but I don't really watch it.
Oh, okay, shoot. Well, anyway, here's a story, right? Or something like a story. I think it's true, I don't know. Is something a strike in baseball because of how the umpire calls it, or because of where the baseball is in relation to the plate, the batter, etc.? Right? Or another way of asking, does the umpire call it a strike because of what the ball does, where it is, or is it a strike because the umpire says so? Right? What's the grounds of something's being a strike? Okay, so one sort of view you might have here is just like there are facts out there in the baseball diamond, and the umpire's job is to like perceive the facts, right? Like the strike facts or whatever. Another view is that the umpire decides what the strike facts are, right? So if the umpire says strike, right, it's a strike, right? If the umpire, so that's the second sort of view, right? That the umpire saying it's a strike makes it a strike, right? On the first view, right, whether something's a strike or not is determined by sort of facts on the ground, right, that don't involve the umpire. The umpire is merely perceiving those facts. Okay, so that's maybe one way of thinking about the distinction, right? Here's another way of thinking about it. So is something the law because it's passed by the legislature, et cetera, or does the legislature pass the decree because it's already a law? Well, obviously the former, right? The legislature makes the laws, right? Congress or whatever. We can ask the same sort of question about God, right? So suppose there are like moral laws, thou shalt not kill, for instance. So did that become a moral law because God like passed the law, right? Or did God merely approve of the law that was already there? Right, on the sort of Martin Luther line, right, what God wills is not right because he ought or was bound so to will. On the contrary, what takes place must be right because he so wills, right? God's making the moral laws, right? They don't exist before God, right? They're not independent of God. God's choosing what they're going to be, right? So if something is right or something's wrong, right, that's determined by what God decided, right? If God had it so decided, right, those things would not be right or wrong. Okay, so here's a way of making the common view precise. We'll call it divine command theory. Okay, so on this view, God's commands make actions right. So an action is good because God commands it, right? God doesn't command it because it's good independently of God. Right? So we can think of it like this. If God hadn't chosen to make some actions right, none of them would be right. Right? So if divine command theory is true and murder is wrong, right? It's wrong because God chose that it would be wrong, right? The alternative to this view is that God is simply responding to the moral facts, right? Some things are good or some things are bad, and God is simply recognizing that. So the alternative view, right, with murder, or with our example of murder, is that, murder was wrong, right? And when God's setting things up, God just recognizes its wrongness and chooses to say, well, thou shalt not murder, right? On this alternative view, God's not making it wrong to murder people. It was already wrong, as it were, right? But on the divine command theory view, right, nothing is good or bad or right or wrong independently of God's commands. Okay, so let's assume that God has chosen, right, to make murder immoral, right? To make it the case that thou shalt not murder, make that a moral law. Okay, on this view, God could have chosen to make murder right, right? Because whether an action is good, right, it's good because God commands it, right? So if God had chosen differently, different things would have been right and wrong on this view, right? And this fits into this story about, look at John Calvin here at the bottom above Martin Luther. God's will is so much the highest rule of righteousness that whatever he wills, by the very fact that he wills it, must be considered righteous, right? So God could have chosen whatever to be moral or immoral, right? And by so choosing, God would have made it right or wrong, no matter what it was, right? So on this view, God could have made murder the moral thing to do. Okay, so that's the view, right? Divine command theory. So back to this question, is an action good or right because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good or right? The divine command theorist says what?
Were you asking us to answer?
Oh yeah, sure.
There. It's good and right because he commands it so.
Right, good. Okay, so yeah, it was a rhetorical question. I paused too long for effect. But yes, good, exactly. So the divine command theorist says that God commands things to be right, and in so commanding, makes it the case that it's good or right or wrong or whatever as the case may be. Okay, so God saying something is good makes it good, and God saying something is bad makes it bad, right, or moral or immoral. Okay, so God isn't out there doing whatever God does, discovering independent moral truths, right? These facts, these moral truths that exist independently of God. Rather, God made the moral truths by choosing that certain things should be right and wrong. Right, so God, on this view, is really powerful, all powerful, right? Going back to this idea that theists tend to think that God is all powerful, right? This view fits in quite naturally with views that emphasize the sort of powerfulness of God, the omnipotence of God. Okay. So how we're going to do this in breakout rooms. We can come back to this one, I guess. Oh, well, maybe we should go with this. So here's a story, right? It takes place in both the Bible and in the Quran. This is the discussion board post, right? So I thought we would sort of talk through it. But in Genesis 22, God commands Abram, he'll become Abraham, right, to sacrifice his son Isaac. The son that Abraham has waited, I forget, like supposed to be like 70 years or something for, right, that God promised him. God tells Abraham to take his son, right, Isaac. In the Islamic tradition, Abram is supposed to sacrifice a different son, Ishmael. But anyway, God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son. It doesn't matter which one. Would God's commanding Abraham to sacrifice his son make it the morally right thing to do? Well, we know what divine command theory would say. What would divine command theory say? Well, they would say, yes, it's the right thing to do if God commands and God's being serious about it. If God says it's the right thing to do, then that's the right thing to do. Okay, what do you folks think?
I feel like if you're subscribed to the divine command theory, then I guess it would make it morally right to do so. But I feel like, especially in this day and age, if somebody were to be like, hey, God wanted me to tell you to sacrifice your son, I feel like the answer would be extremely different.
Yeah, we would think the person is hallucinating or something, right?
Sure, yeah.
But yeah, so in part here, I'm not interested in what divine command theory says, right? I wonder what you folks would think, right? And you point out that we would think very differently of someone who said this today.
I don't think that would make it morally correct, because I'm not like a religious person, so I would not be able to rationalize like murder by thinking like a higher power made it morally acceptable.
Okay, so maybe one thing you're pointing to is that if you're not a theist, then you probably aren't going to be a divine command theorist.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I don't know, it's hard for me to understand their point of view.
Yeah. What do you have difficulty understanding about it, I wonder?
Personally, I am more like agnostic and not really like a certain religion like Catholic or Christian. So
Uh-huh.
I can't really point to like a specific figure that has like specific rules or like even like has contact with like me. So if like, I just don't think that, I'm trying to like make this make sense. I just don't think that it would, I don't know. I just think that like murder in my like own conscience would be so opposed to even like a God telling me that it was morally correct.
Right. Okay. So on this sort of view, or on the view that it sounds like you're suggesting, you sort of go the opposite way, right? If there are any moral laws, right, God would have to recognize them, right? God's simply saying, sacrifice your son or daughter or whatever, isn't enough to make it the case that it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, you put it much better than me.
Well, thank you. No. But yeah, okay, good. So you're not a divine command theorist, as a matter of fact. Okay. So neither of you seem open to the idea that God could make it the right thing to do by commanding it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, good. Okay. Do you think that's a problem for divine command theory? Or more carefully, if divine command theory says that God's saying that you ought to sacrifice your child would make it right, do you think that's an objection to divine command theory? Or a problem for divine command theory?
I don't know if it's necessarily an objection, but I personally would just question it before just blindly following it, I guess.
Yeah, okay. Right, so it seems like there's this consequence of divine command theory that you both find implausible, right? Namely, God could make it right to sacrifice your children by saying, sacrifice your children. It seems like that might be a reason to reject divine command theory. Right, if you have that sort of response to this sort of case. Yeah, okay, well, cool. So we should probably stop here, actually, because the next few slides are the second part of our lecture on God and morality, where we talk about divine command theory and try to find objections to it. So do you have any sort of questions for me, or?
Not right now, no.
Okay, cool. And if you don't, you're free to go. And I'll stop the recording.